I want to introduce you just briefly to my friend Don Currie. The reason why I'm not going to say much about him is because the purpose of our time together is to get to know him and for him to share his story. Now, it's going to be very important that you decide to take some notes there on page 24. Why? Because after about 15 minutes of him sharing his story, you're going to have to take some notes, and we're going to bring you to a dilemma in his life regarding calling. And we're going to then ask you at your tables to discuss what would you do if you were in his position. Then we're going to also ask the tribe leader to just stand up and share what was the consensus that your table came up with. What would you advise Don to do? So in order to advise him, you got to take some notes so you remember, because when it comes to calling, God weaves all parts of our life together. And so, just briefly, Don and I are in a small group. He went through life work in 2010, and I'm not going to say much more other than I know this man very, very well, and it's a thrill for me to introduce to you my American friend from Florida as well, Orlando, Florida. Would you welcome Don Currie? And so,
thank you.
So, Don, I see this picture up here. This is obviously, you are, even as a kid, you were a stud, I tell you. But tell us a little bit about your growing up. Obviously, I guess this is mom and dad. Tell us a little bit about your family and growing up in your early years there.
Yes, so hello, everyone. So very glad to be among brothers and sisters in Christ and those who share this program with me and Steve. So that's a picture of my mom and dad in a car that I think my dad sold pretty quickly after that. But and that's my brother and I in the back. There was a third one to come along, my sister, who's 8 years younger than I am. But that's me on the back with the cat, I guess. Wow, I don't even like cats anymore. Anyway, it was really an idyllic childhood. I was born in New York City. My family moved out to Long Island when I was about 5 years old, and at that time, Long Island was a lot different than it is now. Back then, it was really a haven for young boys who liked the woods and liked to roam around and sometimes get in trouble, but most of the time just have fun. And now it's a much more populated place. I tell the story sometimes that. I used to, what I used to do when I came home from school is I'd drop my book bag, I'd get my pellet gun, I'd hop about 2 or 3 backyards, a set of railroad tracks, go onto the golf course and hunt squirrels for the afternoon until it got dark, and then I'd come home. Today, if you tried to do that on Long Island, you'd have 3 SWAT teams down on you by helicopter. So anyway, it was really idyllic. My grandfather on my mother's side, my mother was from North Carolina, so we used to travel down to North Carolina a lot. And it was just an idyllic childhood, really, until I was 12. It was 1973. My parents divorced. It was a sort of a nasty divorce, and it remained as such almost until the death of one of them, which is pretty much what I had predicted when they first got divorced. So anyway, that was, but other than that, and that really split up the family quite a bit.
What did your dad do?
He was an attorney, a trust and estates attorney in New York City. His side of the family was from Canada, so they were really never into guns. My mother, they just not. But my mother's side of the family was all from North Carolina, so they were very much into guns. And so that's where I got my passion. So I would wait every year. We would take the trip down to North Carolina, and I would just count the hours until I could get down to North Carolina and use my grandfather's .22 or a shotgun and have some fun out there. So
it may not be one of your favorite times in your life, but tell us a little bit more about. You just mentioned your folks getting divorced at 12. It's pretty formative years for you. What's going on there?
Yeah, so I was the oldest, and it was a really rough time for me because I really think that every time my mother looked at me, she thought of my father, and of course she wasn't real happy with my father. So I ended up doing all the things that my father used to do, such as mow the lawn, paint the house, do whatever needed to be done. And my mother really suffered greatly from the divorce. I mean, she took out her frustrations on anybody around her, and I was the subject of most of that. It was not physical abuse in most cases. I mean, she'd throw a vacuum cleaner tube at me every now and then, but really it was more just watching someone just fall apart with anguish for having been left by their husband. So it was a rough time, but my brother, I got out of there about 4 years later when my father sent me away to prep school, which was really a life-saving
Yeah, and this
experience
is
for me.
a picture of your graduation from your prep school, hey?
Yeah, that was my roommate there on the left, Eric Wheeler, good buddy, and or on the right from your perspective. And so the going away to prep school really sort of saved my life. I wasn't doing well in high school, mostly because of the distractions at home. Any excuse I would have to be away from home, I'd use it. So I worked. I found a couple of jobs, and I pretty much worked most of the time for financial independence, mostly because parents were fighting over who should give me an allowance or money, and I never really got an allowance or money, so that was my source of independence. I equated money with independence from the madness in my house.
Yeah.
So.
Obviously, with life work leadership having such a foundation on the spiritual realm, tell us a little bit about any spiritual elements in those early years.
Yeah, so my mother felt that church was extremely important because she wanted to be able to show that she could dress her children very well. Not because we ever discussed our faith at home, but what it did do was give me a foundation that never left me. And with that foundation later came to grow and blossom. But I was confirmed in the Presbyterian church, and I grew up in church in the Presbyterian traditional church. And through that confirmation process and going to church, I learned a few things. So it was very important. Today it was very important for me because I don't know, even though we weren't a particularly Christ-based family, and we didn't discuss our faith at home, it was part of my family's heritage going back a few generations, and it set if had not had that foundation, I'm not sure I would have the faith I do today.
Yeah.
So.
And I see in this picture, obviously, you got a smile on your face. You are graduating. What happened at this point? Where'd you go?
Yeah, so I applied to colleges and ended up going to Bucknell University in Pennsylvania, initially for pre-law. And then a funny thing happened. I decided I was going to join ROTC. I didn't really need a scholarship. My father was fairly well-to-do. But I was never a kid who got allowance, so I had to earn everything probably because my mother was spending all the money on credit cards. But anyway, so I pretty much fended for myself and monetarily. But when I went to Bucknell, I decided what the heck, I'm just going to see what ROTC is all about. And for those of you who don't know what ROTC is, it's Reserve Officers Training Corps. So each service of the military, Army, Navy, Air Force, Marines, has a reserve officers detachment at many universities. So I joined Army ROTC just for the heck of it. They gave me a big duffel bag full of Army clothes. And 6 months into it, as a freshman, one of the cadre from the ROTC detachment said, "How'd you like to go to airborne school?" And I said, "Well, what's airborne school? You learn how to fly airplanes?" "No, you learn how to jump out of airplanes." I said, "Oh, okay." And so Bucknell had this thing called Jan Plan. So we had no school in the month of January. So I was looking forward to the prospect of going home, which wasn't a very pleasant place to be. So I said, "So when is this airborne school thing I would have to go to?" And they said, "January." I said, "Perfect. What do I have to do?" And well, you got to be in good shape. I was running track at the time, and you got to have good grades, and that's about it. What I didn't realize at the time was that freshmen are not supposed to go to airborne school. No one's supposed to go to airborne school until you have basic training. But what I also found out after I got back from airborne school was if I hadn't gone to airborne school, my ROTC detachment would have lost the slot forever. So they essentially fed me as cannon fodder to Fort Benning, Georgia, where I miraculously passed airborne school and came back and finished at the end of January. And I said, I sort of like this Army thing, you know. It's
So this led to this, huh? This
Yeah.
is eventually what you became.
Yeah, well, it was even more exciting than all the great stuff I did in the military was the fact that it occurred to me that this was an unbelievable path to become financially independent from the craziness in my house. So I would no longer have to rely on my parents for money. So I said, this is it. Forget pre-law. I'm going to study political science and international relations. So when my country sends me to foreign lands to fight people, I'll know exactly why I'm there. So that was.
So how did you get to this point in your career?
Well, that's the point where I think that was when I changed command and gave up command of my company. So I commanded my last tour. I was an Army officer for 7 years. My last tour was as a infantry company commander in Panama during the whole Noriega excitement. And so there, I think, is a picture of when I was relinquishing command to the next commander. So it was a great source of pride for me. I loved my time in the military, but at the end of 7 years, I felt like I had really done everything I wanted to do. I had the honor of leading soldiers in combat, and I didn't think it could get possibly any better, and I'd probably have to serve a couple of staff tours, which would be a little boring for me because I was a sort of action guy. So I said, maybe I can take my leadership skills and take them into the marketplace.
Yeah, and so before we go there, looking back on that military experience, obviously leadership focus here, what stands out to you? What's a lesson or two that you learned about leadership in the military?
Well, I learned that going to the field with an American Express card is a lot more fun than going to the field with a rucksack and boots. Which is, I use the American Express card now in case you hadn't figured that out. So, I went to some of the most difficult leadership schools in the Army, and then I ended up being a instructor in the U.S. Army Infantry School and U.S. Army Ranger School. So that was sort of and backing up a little bit, I actually was a riflery counselor at a summer camp. So all of that sort of led me to start thinking that, maybe one of my gifts might be teaching, because I enjoyed it very much. So the instructional piece I enjoyed, and even in a combat unit as an officer, you're a trainer. You're not just a leader, you're a trainer also. So I really did enjoy training and teaching people, and I relished any opportunity I had to do it.
And during this period, any real connection with God at this point as you're going along?
No, not really. In fact, God really went into the back seat in this period of time. In fact, I don't think I've ever told you this, Steve, but I remember the night before we were scheduled to go into combat in Panama, I remember the chaplain coming in. And at that time, I believed that if the chaplain talked too long, then my guys would get a little soft and start to be reminiscent and maybe a little misty. And I couldn't afford that because we were getting ready to load 2.5-ton trucks and drive into, gunfire. Yeah. So I said, now chaplain, and this guy, by the way, this is the same chaplain that married us. I have gotten a little more sentimental, a little close to the Lord since then, but I told him, I said, chaplain, you got 2 minutes. So that was about it.
Well, you have just a little bit longer. I'll give you 3 minutes. So tell me a little bit now. This is a good-looking stud here. He's not in Army stuff now. He's in the corporate world.
It's airbrushed.
Oh, it's airbrushed.
Yeah, it's all airbrushed, yeah.
Got it.
So,
very good.
So, so my corporate life, initially I served with a number of companies. Abbott Laboratories to begin with. I was a political science major infantry officer selling laboratory equipment to reference labs, and most incredibly, I was actually explaining to pathologists and lab technicians as to why they would buy our lab equipment, and which I had no background to do, by the way, but they had a very, very good training program. And so throughout my career, I stayed in pretty much consumer products, mostly sales and marketing, which was my path to management. And so I served with cross pens, cross writing instruments, Fruit of the Loom activewear and sportswear, and then lastly, Dixon Ticonderoga Company in Florida, where I was recruited in 2004.
Yeah, and so we'll come back to that because I want to talk a little bit, obviously, a little bit more about Dixon because that's where the dilemma ended up afterwards. Tell us a little bit, coming out of the Army, you're meeting your wife, Michelle, obviously having a firstborn. Tell us a little bit about what's kind of going on there.
Yeah, so I met my wife, Michelle, who worked for the U.S. government in Panama at the time, and I met her about a month after I got down to Panama. So I was in Panama for almost 3 years. Met her about a month after I got down there in February of '88. We dated for a year and a half, and we got married just before Operation Just Cause, so November of '89. And just I had been actually engaged once before. That didn't work out. I had traveled. I'd been a year and a half in Korea, 3 years in Panama, and I was ready to settle down. But obviously, I was very concerned that it be the right one. And Michelle was terrific. We traveled just about everywhere in Panama you could possibly travel. And for those of you who don't know, from one end to the other, Panama is about 12 hours on 12-hour drive on very narrow, small roads, a lot of which you see, I'm sure some of which are here in South Africa as well. So, and then I got out of the military about 7 months after we got married and after the invasion. We moved to El Paso first, and Michelle became pregnant in about 6 months later. And we had our first baby, which is Lauren, my oldest, and I have three. But my oldest is now 27. She's a nurse, and we had her in 1992.
And then it was her, this firstborn, that really brought out a searching for God at this point, right?
Yeah, I truly believe that the Lord was preparing us for what was to come. So we this is what you do, right? You get married, you buy a house, you find a church, and that's what we did. We found this church right down the road. It was a great church. It was a Presbyterian church, a very loving congregation. They did what I don't know if they do it here in South Africa in the faith community, but it's very common in the south of the United States for the first time someone goes to a church, you write down your name and your phone number and all that, and within the next 2 weeks, you'll get a visit from someone saying, well, thank you for coming, and tell us a little bit about yourself, and let's tell you a little bit about the church. And so these three guys, who I still refer to as the three wise men, came to our front door, knocked on the door, came in, and they sat down, and we served them tea and coffee, and they sort of gently eased into the conversation and asked, and it wasn't the first question, but they eased their way into it, and they said, do you all think you're going to heaven? And my response was every wrong answer you could possibly imagine. Well, I've got this list with pluses and minuses, and I think I'm a little more toward the plus column, but, who knows? I'm always improving. I think I have room for improvement. And after I finished talking and my wife just sort of sat there to see what their reaction was going to be, they said, well, that's not exactly how it works. And so they really exposed us. They took me at that point and my wife from churchgoers to very early believers. And then we had something happen to us about 3 or 4 months later. My daughter at the time, who was 3 months old, went to her second checkup and was diagnosed with congenital heart defect. So she had an atrial septal defect, which is a hole between the upper two chambers of the heart, and she had anomalous pulmonary veins, which is basically veins coming into the heart from the wrong area. And so the only way to fix that was operatively. And we really didn't know what to do. Luckily, I was in the medical field sort of at the time, so I had access to medical libraries as well as a number of physicians to give me advice. And but it was absolutely devastating for us. I would describe my wife and I as walking zombies. We really, and my wife was much less, I would say, emotionally capable of handling it. I had a few more hardening exercises than she had. So I was the strong one, but it was very devastating for us, and the pain and the foreboding about what was to come was overwhelming.
And these people at your church, though, stayed with you and were pretty instrumental, weren't they, in your moving toward Jesus?
Absolutely. I mean, we were at a point where we really felt like there was just nothing that could be done to assuage our pain and our fear about the future. It was our first child, what was going to happen, and the church really put their arms around us. We ended up, to make a very long story short, we ended up going up to Boston Children's Hospital to have the surgery 15 months later. But before all that happened, we were continuing to go to the church, and the church community continued to put their arms around us. But I remember one day, Michelle and I just dropped to our knees and we prayed that the Lord would lift our pain and that He would somehow see us through it and be a comfort to us, and that we would feel Him in a very real and personal way. And I felt almost immediately like the Lord had lifted that pain from me. It was like some of those televangelists you see. That's exactly the way I felt after that prayer. It might not have been something you could take a picture of, but it was certainly something that I felt very deeply. My wife wasn't quite there. She was about halfway there. So I felt at that time that the Lord was going to see us through this, that the Lord was walking beside us, as was the congregation. And it was just a completely different relationship than I had ever contemplated with Jesus.
And so I know we're now at a point here where you're just kind of beginning your corporate career. You have a new family. You also have a new relationship with God. And from what I recall, during the corporate years, your relationship with God kind of remains a little bit more on the infant or toddler stage. Doesn't grow a whole lot during this period, but you know Him, and you have a little bit of a life with Him. But just fill them in a little bit now on just the corporate side of things, and bring us up to Dixon.
Yeah, I would say I was in the a la carte Christian mode at that point, right? So Jesus was there. I knew He was real because He literally lifted the pain off me and helped me comfort my wife, and was a great comfort to her as well. But it was sort of like, well, we were over the crisis. We'd had the surgery. My daughter pulled through miraculously. But it was sort of like, well, I know He's there if I need Him. It wasn't like I was walking day by day with Jesus, asking Jesus, Lord, what is your will? And please let me be your instrument. So I wasn't there yet. And that sort of went on really from 1993 abouts to all the way to the time I got to Dixon at 2004 and even after.
And so tell them a little bit about your career at Dixon, what it is, and just the different positions you had, and then finally the end of your tenure there.
Yeah, so Dixon Ticonderoga Company, for those of you who don't know, Ticonderoga pencils, the little green and yellow ferrules at the top, and we also had a full line of art supplies. And we were the premier cedar pencil, which is, most people say, it's not like rocket science, but we made some very nice pencils, and we were the most well-known brand of pencils. Well, somebody's got to sell pencils, okay? But I was recruited in 2004 there to sort of clean up their marketing, sales, and product line. There had been a lot of marketing folks that had come and gone from big companies, made a mess of things, had products that didn't work. So they were looking for me to retool everything because the family, we were a public company, but the family owned about 40% of the company. And so they told me, they were very upfront with me, we're hiring you, but we're going to sell the company, but you might be a part of it or you might not. And I had negotiated a good contract. So I started that process. Only 10 months later, an Italian company bought us, and they said goodbye to the family, and there were two of us that remained on. The CFO became the CEO, and I was vice president of sales, senior vice president of sales and marketing, and I became EVP of sales, marketing, customer service, and the chief marketing officer. And that took us to about 2005 and 2007, beginning of 2007. The Italians, anybody ever worked for an Italian company? They're very difficult to work for. So you'd create a strategic plan in January, and February 15th it would all be thrown out the window. So they would just it's sort of run like the mafia. You know, they want to keep everybody guessing. So there's only one person that knows everything, and that's the CEO. And everybody else is just they don't know what's going on, and that's the way the CEO likes it. So anyway, so they got a little tired of the CEO, former CFO, and they said, okay, you're promoted to CEO. So there I was, sort of at the top of the pinnacle of my career in the corporate world, CEO of a $100 million consumer products company.
And everything went smooth from that point on, right?
Well, it was very difficult to work for the Italians. And I've never actually told this. Okay, so did you all sign waivers, like not to disclose any of this? So I've never actually. So the Italians were all over us. I mean, all over us to hit financial goals that were nearly impossible. What I found out, it took a year after I left the company for me to find this out. The Italian CEO, young guy, before he became CEO, he was a tennis pro. Dad promoted him to CEO and then left the company. So what I found out is all of this difficulties that we were trying to get the company, really strong financially, that we were actually paying for a young lady friend of the CEO down in Miami in about a $250,000 a year apartment. So it was a very interesting time to work for the Italians and work for Dixon.
But you got let go.
Yeah, so 2008 hit, and so I started working there in 2004. 2008, we had consolidated all of our manufacturing facilities. Both we and the company that bought us had a lot of redundancies. We probably eliminated about 25% of the employees in the company, which was another difficult thing to go through, both for me, of course, but the employees in particular. But it was something that we had to do, and I was certainly directed to do it. And 2008, we had pretty much accomplished all that. They really didn't need a CEO in North America. They really just needed a sales office. And as most of you know, in 2008 was the point at which there was a global recession, and we were hit very, very hard in the U.S. Because we really started that global recession, I think, because of the weakness in the real estate market. So it was our fault, guys. Sorry. So there I was in end of 2008, and not knowing what I wanted to do next, other than, hey, maybe I'll just run another company. But it was the most difficult time in my lifetime to be looking for a job.
And this is where I met a guy named Don Currie at this point in his life. I happened to go out back to church, and I guess Don started going back to church at this point because he's looking for some answers for what's next, right?
Well, I was going to church, but I just more often. Okay. I didn't see you because you were always in the early service. I was in the late service.
Got it.
Listen. I think I said I was married to a Latin, right? So Latins are 30 minutes late for everything. So we were actually 15 minutes late for the second service all the time. So that's why I never met Steve until later on.
And so we're going to ask them in just a second regarding this dilemma of what to do next. Let's set them up for what's going through your life. Like, for instance, you have 3 kids at this point, right?
Yep, 3 kids. Yep.
And tell us a little bit about, you said you got a good contract, but the severance pay is going to run out eventually.
Right.
And Michelle, how is she feeling about this whole thing at this point?
Oh, she's very nervous. So I set up my home office, job search general. And I got the headphone on, and got the computer upgraded, and made sure my dial-in modem was working well. I'm sorry, you guys don't know what that is. And she would come in about twice a day and say, "Any nibbles?" And I would say, "No, honey, I'll let you know when there's something." But that would happen about once or twice a day, which of course didn't help my morale much. But I certainly felt the pressure, with her not working at the time, and with 3 kids, and knowing the severance was going to run out at some point.
Yeah. So you're his friend like I was at that point. And I decided I'm going to start striking up a relationship with him. He's at a point where he's searching. He's a Christian, kind of doing the a la carte thing, really not that committed to the Lord, but wants to be. And he's at a great point to just be molded and shaped. But he's got a lot of pressure on him. After a while, money will run out. He's got a wife that's anxious, got 3 young children. What advice would you give someone if you went out for a cup of coffee? So for the next 5 to 7 minutes, I'd like to just have you discuss at your table, what advice would you give Don Currie at this dilemma in his life? He doesn't really know anything about calling at this point. He might say, yeah, I want to do what God wants him to do. He's not really clear on calling yet. He doesn't understand that concept.
I thought I was, though.
Yeah, you thought you were, right. So you're kind of dealing with this, right? So what advice, what might you share with him as he is essentially searching for the next step in his life? All right? Enjoy your conversation around the table for the next 5 to 7 minutes. All right, well, Don, tell us the rest of the story.
Yeah, so, I had a strong belief in God. I knew that I could rely on Him to pull me out of a ditch, but didn't really understand what walking with Jesus really felt like or meant over a long stretch of time. So I was basically an ex-CEO with 2 years' experience. I marketed as hard as I could to private equity companies, even some consulting gigs. I did a couple of small consulting gigs, but basically nothing was coming to fruition. So in, I believe it was the end of 2009, I started life work, and part of that was calling. And but the time was running out, and I had to do something. So and I was networking pretty heavily locally. So I had lunch with a guy who was working for a company called Robert Half International. They're a $35 billion financial services company. There was an opportunity in the city of Orlando to run. They liked CFOs and CEOs to run their senior financial consulting group. So I joined Robert Half with no other options really in the offing, and just threw myself into it as I do and did everything, and actually made President's Club within the first 6 months, but slowly came to the realization that I absolutely hated my job. I mean, I hated my job. You had to do everything that it just wasn't in my nature to do. A lot of cold calling, a lot of going to networking events, trying to hit people up over vodka tonics, and it just wasn't working for me. And the really, really difficult thing is once I realized I hated it, it was just like a snowball. Like I kept telling myself that I hated it, and then the next day I would tell myself, man, I really hate it even more. And it just did not get any better. It just didn't get any better. So I remember at the time I was going through life work. I was going to church at the same church with Steve. And I was also really into a couple of theologians. One was R.C. Sproul. I don't know if you all know who he is, but he is probably, he died recently, but he's probably one of the most incredible theologians of our time, I think. And he's got a ton of DVDs, books, all downloadable. So every subject you could possibly want on faith, he's got it. And just very cerebral. I just got a lot out of him. But the other thing is I had to commute downtown to Orlando to work every day. So it was about 45 minutes. And it just happened to be at the exact time that Alistair Begg was on the radio. Who knows Alistair Begg? Oh my gosh, you gotta. First of all, he's got a really cool accent, just like you guys. He's Scottish, and really amazing guy. So I would listen to his sermons every day. So this went on now for 3 years, and toward the end of the third year, I'm like, I cannot do this another day. I'm going to quit. I got to quit. So I made an appointment with my boss, and I said, I'd like to meet with you tomorrow morning if I could. Oh, yep, 11 o'clock, we'll meet just before lunch. Okay, great. So I told my wife, I'm going to quit. What are you going to do, honey? I don't really know, but I can't do it anymore. I hate it. And I can't possibly find a job while I'm in this job. So that was on a Friday. Went in, my boss said, sorry, I can't meet with you at 11. We'll have to do it Monday. I'm like, okay. So I was like, well, at least I have the weekend to sort of breathe. And so went to church, went to Life Work that previous week, and then listened to my Alistair Begg sermon on the way in on Monday morning. And to make a very long story short, I got the same message from all three of those touch points, which was, it's not your timing, it's God's timing, and God wants you exactly where you are. And it was so powerful, these three messages, that first of all, it was absolutely undeniable as anything but God speaking to me. There's no way it could be coincidence. And lastly, I felt in the strongest way possible that had I gone in and quit that morning, I would have been looking God right in the face and defying him and basically disobeying him, because it was such a strong message that I got. So I stayed in it. 2 months later, I got a call from one thing I didn't talk too much about is I was very heavily in the competitive shotgunning arena, and I had been since 2001. Well, really 2005, but I started in 2001. And so I had started writing for the magazines, the shooting magazines. I also had a company approach me to do my first video, so I did my first video in 2012. Right after that video came out, it was about 2 months later, I had an organization approach me about running a 27,000-acre private hunting preserve, quail, pheasant, hogs, deer up in northern Florida. So I did that. So now I was really making that break from the corporate world over into this world that I had lived in for a while, but as a hobby. And the most amazing part of the whole thing was I told myself all along, man, it would be great if I could be in a career in this area. But I'm a numbers guy. I ran the numbers. I'm like, there's no way I can support my family on a career like that. But anyway, I trusted the Lord, and that's what I'm doing now, full time. I'm one of the probably only about a dozen full-time professional instructors. I mean, there are a lot of instructors in the U.S. There are also a lot of very highly competitive shooters that sort of do it to earn money, because you can't really earn a living on competing. But I'm one of the few, about a dozen of us that are full-time instructors. I tour around the country, a little bit in Mexico, a little bit Dominican Republic, and now South Africa. And that's what I do for a living. I also do a lot of gun fitting, and about 4 months after I left the club, 2 years later, so I ran that club for 2 years. I left the club 2 years later, looking for another opportunity because the culture there just wasn't what I wanted. And before I could find another job, my lesson business just went through the roof. 2 months after that, I was approached by the National Sporting Clays Association to run their instructor program. So I now teach full-time, do gun fittings. I'm a gun dealer for all shotguns and all sporting, so birds, clay targets, that sort of thing. And so I also sell Parazzis and Purdy's and do fittings for them, and actually consult with them on their shotgun development. And so before I could find the next job, I actually had one and didn't realize it. So all of these things, I will tell you that I could just tell you so many instances where it was so blatantly obvious to me that the Lord's hands were all over this. Because, I mean, how can you conceive of, as CEO of a company, how could you conceive of, 3 years later you'd be a professional instructor, full time, and you could actually be supporting your family in a meaningful way. So,
And this is your family here.
that is my family
Yeah.
there. Yeah. So, my
Michelle's standing in front of you.
I'm in
Your
the back.
brother.
Michelle's in front of me. Yep. My brother's on the right. My dad is right in the middle behind the turkey, and my sister's on his right, and my first child is back in the back with the glasses on the top of her head, the one with the congenital heart defect. She's now a NICU nurse in the neonatal intensive care unit, caring for the same kids that she happened to be 27 years prior to that. And then on the far left lower, that's Catherine. She's studying to be a physician's assistant, which I know you don't have here in South Africa, but they're basically quasi-doctors. So they work under a doctor, but they do a lot of the diagnosis and prescribing. And then there's my little one, one in from the end on the bottom with all the Christmas lights around her. That's Sarah. And I will tell you that, to make a long story short, that child was sent to us from God. There's no question about it. She was an oops baby. So my kids are 27, 21, and 13. I always, when we're in a party, I always tell people when my wife's listening that the only reason we had her is because she couldn't keep her hands off of me. But she was truly, if you know my whole story, you'd know that with every bit of confidence that the Lord sent her to us to save our marriage. Because at the time we were going through some very difficult times. I was traveling an insane amount, for many years. And so this year will be our 30th year of marriage. And she's made me a lot easier to get along with. She's worked on me really hard. And I'm thankful for it.
And I would say, in closing, as Ron comes up here to take the mic from me, just to say this, that when we discuss that there is one primary calling, it is come, follow me. This guy has had numerous secondary callings. But the reason why he has found his passion and is so much in his zone is that he brought focus back to the one primary calling. Come, follow me. He got closer and closer and closer to him. And now he hears his whispers. And he's able to discern whatever else happens in these secondary callings. So, learn from case studies. And he'll be here now for the rest of this retreat up until noon tomorrow. So feel free to contact him and interact with him regarding anything else regarding calling. And we'll talk a little bit tomorrow on relationships.
Can I say one more thing?
Sure. Real quick.
So, I guess I can't say anything else. That cut me off, just like on the David Letterman show. If I had, there came a time, we in the corporate world worry about the logic of our resume, right? And how does your resume look? And does it look like there's a steady progression there? And, Jesus doesn't give a rip about the flow of your resume, okay? And I think that the sooner you discard concern about the flow of your resume and start to understand that our life has seasons, you heard that from John earlier, that our primary calling is our primary calling, but that primary calling and that giftedness that the Lord has equipped us all with will manifest itself in different places of His choosing at different times and at different seasons. So start to think of your resume or your history as a series of seasons rather than some linear progression that the world is looking for. Think about what the Lord is looking for and know that our destination is eternity. It's not a pristine resume.
Thank you so much to Don.